So I have 10:01. So I say, let's get the party started. Greetings, everyone. Good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you might be. I am Alan Suma, the Executive Director at Eurasia Group Foundation, or EGF. And on behalf of myself, the entire team, our board, welcome. We're delighted that you all took time out of your busy days and are curious to learn more about our recently released report on American attitudes about U.S. foreign policy. So just a few words about EGF and why we exist. We actually work to make sense out of major geopolitical events. We try to translate them in ways that make sense for a wide variety of stakeholders, from thought leaders and policymakers to the general public to underserved students. We try to come at things with a new view, a different lens, and present geopolitical events in ways that allow people to engage for themselves, for their communities, and get involved with the world. We are vehemently nonpartisan. We are empirically based, and we strive to tell the good, bad, and the ugly about any potential situation. We're not cheerleaders, we're not advocates, we are political scientists in that regard. So we approach that mission with three main paths, The first, we work to educate young people. We design and launch curriculums for underserved high school students about the major geopolitical events that affect their lives. So to date, we've released a unit on globalization, and we're working to do additional units on climate change, AI, all sorts of geopolitical events that young people need to understand to manage their lives. The second path we take is None of the Above, or NODA, our podcast, in which we talk to a variety and a diverse base of kind of global thinkers and get their thoughts on what's happening in the world, US foreign policy, what's good, what's bad, what's working, what they see in the future. And we've been doing the podcast for several years now and are excited about the breath of fresh air that it's bringing maybe to some of these foreign policy discussions. And then finally is our research and Independent America, which is what brings us all here today. Our Independent America project was inspired by our board founder and president, Ian Bremmer, in 2016 wrote a book called Superpower. And in that book, he laid out three paths that the US might take in the world. And Independent America is one of those paths. And so Mark will talk more about the project, but I just wanted to highlight that's kind of our guide star for the work we do on IA. And it surrounds exploring, investigating, and talking to people about what a less militarized US foreign policy might look like, who wins, who loses, and what does that all mean to the US and to certainly the world. And so that's what we're going to be talking to you about later shortly here. Mark has led two main efforts for IA surveys that happen once a year. And for this year in the fall, we're talking about our fourth survey about American attitudes about US foreign policy. And I think what makes it particularly exciting and interesting is that serendipity. We were conducting the surveys during the chaotic and sometimes heartbreaking withdrawal from Afghanistan. So I was particularly curious about how that might show up in the results. So Mark and the IA team will be going over that here shortly. A couple of just quick housekeeping things. The team will be talking about the results, but we are saving time for some questions. So you should have a question window on your Zoom. You can submit questions to us at any time during the program. So certainly please get those in. And I would be remiss if I didn't say there's a lot of information on our website. And so please visit egfound.org for more information about any of our work. And certainly myself and the entire team will love to talk with any of you about any of our work. So with all the preliminaries out of the way, let me introduce the team. First up will be Mark Hanna. He's our senior fellow. He's been with the IA project since the beginning. He really is the maestro and has developed the strategy and the approaches that we have developed over the last 4 years. And he'll be talking to you specifically about the report, interesting findings and the like. But then we'll bring on 2 more members of the team. Caroline Gray is our senior researcher and producer of NOTA. She's been with us for over 2 years and has been instrumental in helping us think through these questions, think through what the answers mean, and writing the report, which, as you all know, is always a Herculean effort. And then finally, we're joined by Lucas Robinson. We were lucky enough to have Lucas working with us as an intern, and just a month ago, he joined us as a full-time staff. So he's been going through the data, working on the questions, and will be involved in the conversation as well. So thank you again. We're excited to present these results. We think it's interesting and puts a new flavor on some things that have been in the ethos for a long time. And I will now step aside and hand it over to Mark Hanna.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you everybody for your interest in our survey and our work. It is as Alan suggested, a total team effort. Before we get into the findings from this year, I want to give a brief overview of what this Independent America project is and why it exists. There's a sense that our board president and founder Ian Bremmer had sort of in the years leading up to the election of Donald Trump, that the American people's preferences when it comes to foreign policy were either not particularly pronounced or audible within the corridors of official Washington, or that they weren't necessarily being attended to if they were audible. And there certainly there are a number of organizations that do put out public opinion surveys every year, and we can talk about what differentiates ours in a minute. But while there are sort of expressions of public preferences and public opinion on national security and foreign policy topics, the foreign policy communities, the professional foreign policy communities, regard for that wasn't necessarily high or widespread. And so this is intended to, this project, the Independent America Project, is intended to explore ways, not just sort of we can pursue a less militarized US foreign policy, but how the public's sort of preferences, which do align a lot more with sort of academic opinion than they do with policymaking opinion, can be more fully expressed and connected to the policymaking apparatus that exists. So, our entire sort of work is predicated on the assumption that public opinion matters. It should be taken seriously, especially as we promote democracy around the world. We're promoting a system of government that is based on sort of the consent of the governed, government by the people. And so it's sort of a quaint notion, potentially, and one that I think is that animates and motivates us on a daily basis. I also want to just say that the sort of title of this project, Independent America, isn't suggesting that the United States can be or should be extracted from the various interdependencies of international politics, right? There are ways in which economies are tethered together with modern transportation innovations. People and goods and commerce can flow unbound by various state sort of regulation and state sort of state imposed barriers that existed in the past. So what we're trying to argue here is that the United States international conduct should be based on a sort of spirit or approach to the world that prioritizes America's own interests, and that when it does promote its values, that it doesn't do it in a way that backfires on those interests or backfires on or undermines those values. So we'll get into all that somewhat soon, and Lucas Robinson, who we're thrilled to have joined us recently, will lead a Q&A. He'll have questions for us, and then we'll kick it to the audience. But that's what animates our work. So with all that, I will pass the baton to Lucas, and he can tee up the discussion.
Thank you, Mark. My first question is actually to you. With all the data collected on American views on many different issues, what do you think is the report's biggest takeaway?
So this is tricky. This is our fourth year, as Alan mentioned, of doing this report, and in many ways, our report's findings are consistent with previous years that find general public support for engagement in the world diplomatically, and in fact, the amount of diplomatic engagement that is desired by the American public might surprise some people in Washington, and we do find, like we have again in years past, a desire for less of a security sort of forward deployed posture around the world, fewer security commitments, and ambivalence or even opposition to following through in some cases on those commitments. So every year we do find this sort of general, and I'm generalizing as all survey instruments have to, because they're imprecise and imperfect instruments of gauging public opinion, but general support for diplomatic engagement and general opposition relative to sort of what we find in Washington, opposition to sort of military first foreign policy. So we have to find new ways of describing that and expressing that year in, year out. But this is the first year where we've had 4 years of data, so we're able to actually look at some trends over time, and Caroline Gray will get into that really soon. But one thing we have noticed is, at least in the past 2 years, there has been sort of an acceleration of this desire to focus on democracy at home, this desire to potentially not engage or not intervene when it comes to humanitarian causes. And as Alan mentioned, our data were collected right in the middle of the sort of evacuation of Kabul, right? So right after Kabul fell, we were expecting to some extent, and every year we do this, there's some news events and current events that are going to be in the forefront of our respondents' minds and might shape our responses in some ways. We thought, given all the news narratives out there about the US needing to kind of follow through on its commitment to democracy and to the Afghan people, or the US potentially signaling to adversaries that it's not, lacking resolve, that would be expressed in public opinion. We didn't find that. In fact, when it came to the Afghanistan war, the primary takeaways had to do with the limitations of American military might and the inability to affect political outcomes do nation building and such through military means. And so, yes, we're starting to see in the past 2 years, as we move from Donald Trump presidency to Joe Biden's presidency, some of these trends, the upticks and the downticks or the dips have become more pronounced in the past year. So that's interesting to see.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I would love to hear from Caroline about more of these trends that we've been seeing over the past 4 years.
Yeah, thank you both. So yeah, as Mark said, this is the first year, now that this is the 4th year of the survey, that we're starting to be able to track some really interesting shifts in Americans' foreign policy attitudes. The first trend I want to point out concerns how Americans view foreign policy broadly. In short, the data suggests that Americans are increasingly interested, as Mark said, in focusing on the health of US democracy at home rather than promoting it overseas. For context, we developed a series of questions based on 4 different US foreign policy worldviews or debates. This classification of 4 different types of worldviews was developed by political scientist Walter Russell Mead. And he developed this classification system because for him, throughout American history, there really have been 4 major battles or debates over foreign policy that really haven't changed all that much. There are people who want to focus inward on domestic needs, the Jeffersonians. Others want to focus on spreading democracy and the rule of law around the world, the Wilsonians. Others want to rely more on securitized measures to promote peace and stability, the Jacksonians, and others think that a strong economy and global commerce are the best ways to ensure stability, the Hamiltonians. So we use this typology to be able to better classify the American public, to better understand their preferences, which are nuanced. We didn't want to accept that there is simply an interventionist view and an isolationist view. There's more going on here. And this typology kind of helped us sort all of that out. So as you can see, the Jeffersonian worldview, which maintains that the U.S. should be focusing more on democracy at home and less on promoting it forcefully overseas. That worldview has increased over the past 4 years, especially within the past year. There's been a 35% increase since 2018 in the number of Americans who would identify with this worldview. And the number of respondents categorized as Wilsonians, or those who think the US should promote democracy overseas, has decreased. And this is interesting and intriguing because the Wilsonian outlook, which is declining, is arguably what most foreign policy leaders in Washington believe in. They believe that it is the kind of moral duty of the US to spread the rule of law, to spread American values around the world. And that worldview is kind of decreasing, and others are taking its place. And it's interesting given the past 2 decades of war and Americans really wanting to see something different. Another interesting trend I wanted to point out has to do with humanitarian policy. The data I just talked about, could be interpreted as Americans being increasingly isolationist, turning away from the world, but that goes against actually a lot of the data we have found. For instance, like Mark said, nearly 3 times as many Americans want to increase rather than decrease diplomatic engagement with the world. And various data points that we wrote about in our report point to that. We asked a question about how Americans think the US should respond to human rights abuses. Does the US have a responsibility to protect vulnerable populations outside of its borders? And we found that a plurality of respondents believe that it is up to organizations like the UN. They should be taking the responsibility and responding to human rights atrocities, not individual countries like the US. And we saw this belief increase over the past 4 years, and interest in the US taking the lead to militarily intervene in these situations decrease. So there is definitely shifting attitudes here in terms of militarized humanitarian intervention and more interest in multilateral organizations taking the lead. And the last thing I'd like to point out in terms of trends and what we're seeing change concerns young Americans. We've been polling Americans since 2018, and the youngest group, Americans ages 18 to 29, have grown increasingly wary of America's, use of military force. They're really interested. This age group is especially interested in focusing on democracy here at home. Most young Americans are skeptical of the notion of American exceptionalism. We've seen that number drastically, decrease this past year by 38%. Young Americans are more concerned with the US, focusing on preserving the rights of US citizens, less concerned with promoting democracy abroad. And this year, more than other years, we've seen young Americans have more interest in decreasing defense spending, decreasing the defense budget. So all of these things point to, Americans, especially young Americans, being, again, more interested in focusing inwards and being an exemplar of democracy as opposed to, forcefully promoting it overseas.
Very interesting. Now I kind of want to touch upon the report's title. It's titled Inflection Point, Americans' Foreign Policy Views After Afghanistan. So how do you think the war in Afghanistan and the war on terror generally, how do you think it's shaped Americans' views on foreign policy, Caroline?
The war on terror has likely shaped the opinions of Americans in a lot of ways, especially young Americans who have really known nothing but America's post 9/11 wars. We, of course, can't say for sure that the war on terror or the war in Afghanistan has contributed to these beliefs, but it certainly would appear so, given that Americans are increasingly skeptical of the use of military force after 2 decades of inconclusive and unwinnable wars we have seen. And so a couple data points here I'd like to point out. Like Mark mentioned, the war in Afghanistan appears to have made Americans, more skeptical of the use of force, of nation building. We asked respondents what they thought the biggest lesson from the war was. Most respondents think that the biggest lesson was that the US should not be in the business of nation building, or that it should only send troops into harm's way if national interests are threatened. Along with skepticism of nation building, many Americans seem to be skeptical of America's extensive overseas military network as well. This year, we found a plurality of Americans want to decrease the number of US troops stationed overseas and reduce security commitments in continents like, the Middle East and Asia. Like I mentioned, support for US-led military intervention to stop human rights abuses has also decreased. So there does seem to be just a wariness of war and an interest in avoiding war after 20 years of the war on terror. So it certainly seems like it has had some effect.
Gotcha. Interesting. And shifting gears now over to China. Some in Washington and Beijing are using language urging a new Cold War, pointing to a seemingly inevitable conflict and crisis in the Taiwan Strait. So Mark, what does the report say about America's military posture vis-a-vis China?
Happy to talk about that. You set this question up, and it's totally true. We saw the Washington Post this morning have an editorial basically arguing for more of an investment in military might in Asia. So that was interesting. That this is becoming more of a mainstream. It's almost as though the conversation of Taiwan, the number of utterances of this island democracy is sort of increased as the references to Afghanistan has sort of receded in the rearview mirror. And based on what Caroline said is about American support for force posture around the world applies to Asia. I think we have a slide on. We asked people what U.S. policy should be toward China given its growing influence, its international influence, right? So we basically, one thing that distinguishes our survey from other organizations doing work in this space is we don't presume a ton of knowledge on the part of our respondents. So we could be accused potentially of priming them by presenting information that we deem and test as is to be sort of contextual and neutral. But in this, the verbatim question here, just so that we're being transparent, is set up a bit of information. And that information was China's relative power and influence and international influence has increased significantly in recent years. What should US policy toward China, or which US policy toward China comes closer to your own preference? So you can see the answer options that people were given, and the public was generally split down the middle, the 50-50, and this is the second year we've asked this question, and in the second year in a row, it's basically been split down the middle on whether we should respond to a rising China or an increasingly influential China by increasing or decreasing America's military presence. We gave people a binary option because we wanted to force them into one of those two choices, and knowing full well that there might be people who say, I don't have an opinion on this matter, or stay the same, would have been invited a lot of responses. So we sort of forced people into a binary. The American public, or at least our survey takers, which is representative of the public largely, came down and said basically we are, as a collective, ambivalent on this issue. Caroline will show that there are some breakdowns when it comes to age cohorts, but the primary reason that half of our more than 2,000 respondents wanted to decrease America's military presence wasn't this kind of peacenik accommodationist, like we just think that China should be perfectly natural that China would seek more influence and we should accommodate China's rise. That was the least popular. You see it as number 3 here when respondents were asked to rank the rationale for their choice. And the most sort of popular rationales were those kinds of realist concerns with an unnecessary burden on American soldiers and taxpayers, and also that allies can, affluent allies, wealthy allies, can and should be able to defend themselves, should be empowered by the US, not sort of be mere protectorates of the US. And then also that the presence of American troops could be perceived by China to be threatening or a provocation. And then the least popular answer option for people who want to increase military presence is that that presence would act as a deterrent. So when I read, for example, in today's Washington Post, the case for investing more in hard power and naval sort of America's Navy in East Asia, the main reason that people in kind of elite circles and foreign policy writers are citing is the deterrent possibility. And there was even a member of Congress today who wrote that we should that Congress should give an authorization for the use of force as a deterrent to President Biden. But that's the least popular rationale for increasing the US military presence in Asia. The main rationale given has to do with international shipping lanes and the US interest in narrowly protecting that economic artery. So and we'll move to the next, because we did ask about Taiwan specifically, and this was the first year we did. We asked about, I don't know if you can see the whole infographic there, but the American public largely doesn't know what to think on Taiwan, and some of this could be in the research, in the sort of question design. We threw a lot of information at the survey takers. This type of technique is called a factorial vignette. I won't get into too much detail, but if you have questions in the Q&A with the methodology, we're happy to talk about it. Basically, we expose the respondent to a stimulus, we give them new information, and then ask them. So it's an experiment embedded within a survey. But we talk about, how China's civil war after World War II, how the communists took over mainland China, the nationalists fled to this island nation that is now called Taiwan. So we gave them a bunch of information, and when we asked, should the US military defend Taiwan, and giving both a pro and con answer like you would in a kind of referendum vote in a state, state election, a large percentage of the population, 41.6%, are not sure. Generally, Republicans were more hawkish than Democrats, but a very significant portion of each partisan affiliate, sort of partisan group, was not sure what to think. So for people who are advocating one way or the other, restraint or a more muscular or assertive approach, this is sort of a jump ball right now. This is kind of, this 41.6% is being is largely being sort of targeted by policymakers on both sides who are advocating for their point of view. I see that I'm going to, in the interest of time, because I see we want to leave a lot of time for Q&A, I'm going to stop talking now, and hopefully we can zip through one or two quick questions and then get to your questions. So thanks again for your interest.
And just a reminder, if you have any questions, feel free to leave your name and your affiliation in the chat. And while you come up with your questions, I would like to send one over to Caroline. I'm really interested in hearing about the different, how different generations view foreign policy. So I was wondering if you could maybe go into some detail about that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So it might not come as a surprise that younger Americans are less hawkish, more wary of war and the use of military force than older generations. And this can really be seen in most of the questions we asked. Like I mentioned, young Americans are the most likely age group to believe that the US is not an exceptional nation. Older generations are much more likely to kind of buy into that belief. Young Americans are the most likely age group to want to decrease the defense budget more than any other age group. It's particularly interesting when looking at the question about the use of US drone strikes. Over half of young Americans ages 18 to 29 are skeptical of the use of drones. A majority of them either think that drones are imprecise and endanger the lives of civilians, or that they, damage America's reputation and stoke anti-American sentiment internationally. As you can see, the older age groups are much more likely to think that US drone strikes are an effective tool in counterterrorism efforts, or are less costly than sending US troops into harm's way. So that's a pretty interesting difference between the generations. Young Americans are also less sure of economic sanctions and their effectiveness. They're a little more concerned potentially about their utility, their effectiveness in shaping, political outcomes in other countries. And going back to this question of the rise of China and how America should respond, young Americans are the most skeptical of building up America's defense posture in order to counter the threats coming from China. 62%, almost 63% think that the US should reduce its military presence in Asia and have regional allies step up and come to the defense of countries that are insecure. So it really is pretty stark. And most of the questions we ask, the difference between young Americans and older Americans, and it'll be interesting to see how that plays out in the next batch of surveys we do, if that kind of belief and worldview of being skeptical of the use of force maintains.
Interesting, very interesting. So while we wait for some questions to roll in, I have a question for you, Mark. I'm interested in seeing what the American public thinks about negotiating with Iran over its nuclear program. Biden started negotiations when he came in as president, but since throughout the summer, they've been stalled. So I'm just wondering what the American people think.
Just getting off mute here. Yeah, in general, the American people, we had a great question on the sort of appetite for negotiating with allies, or excuse me, negotiating with directly with adversaries, right? This is sort of a general question about, you know, in order to avoid military confrontation, or should the U.S. Negotiate even with adversaries, even if they're human rights abusers, dictators, or home to terrorist organizations? And you know, this kind of gets at the security logic of the war on terror, which, or at least in its early years, where you know, the U.S. Explicitly would not do those kinds of negotiations. But right now we've got 63% of Americans saying they do want the U.S. to negotiate with adversaries. The Iran nuclear deal in particular has also, there's a lot of public support for its revival, and 63% support reviving nuclear negotiations with Iran and pursuing an agreement, which, you know, prevents or prolongs the ability for Iran to develop those nuclear weapons. So there is a constituency. I mean, this is one issue that has become sort of susceptible to the partisan polarization that we've seen, because Republicans have run on overturning or tearing up these negotiations. They don't see them as effective instruments, or and Democrats and independents too have largely seen them as positive steps taken to prevent an arms race in that part of the world. So in general, our response, like I said, 63% find support. This is going to be something that continues to be in the news the more these kind of talks go forward. The election of Raisi in Iran, a hardliner anti-Western president in August, has certainly complicated the talks, but it is still very much a big part of President Biden's agenda to get those back on track. And people in the administration will be heartened to see, you know, our survey results showing support for that.
Interesting. Yeah, and then I have a question for you, Caroline. So Americans are generally, they want to see a less militarized foreign policy. So I'm interested, there's been, you know, in the news recently, there's been a lot of bipartisan support in Congress for taking back congressional war powers. So I'm just wondering, how do the American people line up on that issue?
Yeah, it's one of my favorite questions to look at because you know, it is so clear where the American public stands, regardless of party and regardless of age. 76% of the American public supports more congressional oversight over the use of force and thinks that the president has too much, you know, needs to cede some of that authority to Congress. And again, this is across party lines. This is across the generational divide. And it makes sense. You know, it is a bipartisan effort in Congress, you know, currently, and has been over the past 4 years to bring back congressional oversight over the use of military force. So it is pretty clear where the American public stands, and it really doesn't change no matter if there's a Republican in office, in the White House, excuse me, or a Democrat. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. Thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Mark. I think we had an excellent discussion. And yeah, thank you for everyone who came.
Thank you, everybody. It's I want to thank everybody for taking time out of the day. I know this is the fall season is busy work-wise, and for spending an hour, 45 minutes with us. If you have any questions, we can circulate our contact information to anybody who attended, so we can be happy to talk with you one-on-one, or email you if there's a particular issue or topic that you don't feel the report goes into enough detail, or you'd like to get a data set or a data table. Definitely reach out to our team. We're happy to be transparent and collaborate. So do reach out. And again, thank you for coming and spending time with us. Thank you, Lucas, for your thoughtful questions, and thank you, Alan, for the overview of Eurasia Group Foundation. So do go to our website. You'll see the whole report there. You'll see also videos that we've done recently addressing certain foreign policy topics, egfound.org. And if you're interested in our podcast, None of the Above, do go to noneoftheabovepodcast.org or look us up anywhere you get podcasts. Thank you, everybody.